that we could use whatever reference system we want. Like it needs to be our own reference system, like the one we invented, but it has to be consistent. The thing is that I want to track the code. So when I do it, yeah.
I feel like stressing for the person name. Sorry, what? You're also using that print.
I know. Like I was looking at the chat yesterday, but I was like, I need concentration. No, but that's okay. Like signature is fine.
Sometimes I have a bit of trouble with this thing when it says in the very start of the Spanish pages at the whole room when I'm reading. Could you elaborate on that? I think it's called governance.
And you know, we find this review.
Do you want to have any reading? No, I don't know actually. Like, we won't do review.
So you with the big example. Very cool. It's a theme.
And it seems so easy in the practice. Like it's just another exam, like you don't have to learn anything new, it's just what you already know.
But it's kind of more like for example, I meant like it was okay because I've never heard the concept in English. The thing is that when they bring it to the translate, so which can be is good and bad. It's good for a lot of people don't speak English, so it's good because they can see the show and it's like it's the same with production. They create a whole production, but they shows like the sound. So, for example, I was like 10 years old when I watched so I really like I liked it. But when I went to read it, I had a relationship of feeling like I've never seen the show.
Oh, you're right.
But I've listened to the soundtrack, and I heard the Spanish version. For some people worked,
The what?
but for others it was like, you killed it. I mean, it's like...
And you don't have...
the integrity of the play is different, so... So yeah, I prefer I know that I was
Yes. I bought the expensive one because I wasn't early enough. Oh yeah. Yes. I didn't like it again. No, I arrived with nothing else in my life. I'm gonna get one. Oh, did you have to put that? Feel like I can ride in one month.
Get everything in the next month and then you'll start over again.
Okay, so we will be sort of concluding the equity side of things by talking about returns of cash. It tends to be a very important aspect of corporate governance, certainly if you look at the figures and the recent deals being done, and that's been pretty constant, certainly after the last financial debacle globally. Most companies basically give cash out, and the issue for the corporate finance lawyer is trying to structure the payout mechanism in a way that sort of makes sense and suits the preferences of the recipient class, bearing in mind that it's not a very homogeneous group. A typical pension fund may have a different expectation from just ordinary investors, or indeed a hedge fund. So we're really interested in how to use the tools we have studied elsewhere in an instrumental fashion. If you're in business school, the sort of things people talk about, because this is a very big topic in business schools, would be, you know, capital structure decisions. In other words, what kind of size of debt should you have relative to equity? There are two aspects of capital structure decisions, the one I just mentioned, but also the effect of your dividend policy on our firm rating, i.e., do you, by paying out more, do you increase firm value? Some people say, well, you do not need to pay out, right? Shareholders can manufacture their own dividends. So for a long time, for instance, Apple never paid out a dividend, but the share price of Apple always increased. So you basically, you do your DIY dividend, right? Because if your shares increase in value, and every now and then Apple does a share split, right? Because after a while the share will be too heavy, so you do a subdivision like we did. So you take one share, you create two out of it. Then you could sell, right, from those subdivisions, sell in the market and get your own dividend. So that's one way. Or Apple decides to do a bonus share issue, so they capitalize some of their profits. You take some of your bonus shares, you sell. So Apple did not need actually to pay a dividend until activist shareholders began to take an interest in this. And that raises another question, and that is the whole issue of corporate governance. Because activist investors take the view that, you know, we need dividends to come out. Some pension fund managers take a very different view. In fact, I'll show you two letters sort of illustrating this. So take the Bite the Apple memo, right? So the Bite the Apple memo is written by Martin Lipton's firm, Wachell, Lipton and Rosen. So this firm is really important, right, in corporate finance, right? They were the ones who came up with the poison pill. Their memos are, in a sense, iconic in the market. So here you see Martin Lipton basically commenting on the hedge fund attack on Apple, right? This company, which is a bastion of American capitalism, a model company, suddenly being attacked on its payout policy. I could see that in slow motion. Yeah, you know, so you see the firm basically, usually Martin Lipton basically writes, and he says the activist hedge fund attack on Apple, a successful company, is a clarion call for effective action to deal with the misuse of shareholder power. So this is in the context of a debate about how you balance management power with shareholder power. Do we give more power to management? Because if you give more power to management, then they would say, you know, we determine payout policy. We can decide not to pay out. We can spend more money on R&D, right? If you give more power to shareholders, shareholders basically say, we basically want to control. So kind of similar to the argument about who controls capital structure. Who controls capital? Remember, we talked about this, who controls capital structure? And we saw, we came to the conclusion that really shareholders do control capital structure, right? Because the Companies Act has given shareholders that power. Remember, we talked about Section 551 and all that. And then we compared it with the US position, where we see a different balancing. So in a sense, that is what we're seeing being mirrored here. And then it says, the voting power of shareholders is being harnessed by a gaggle of activist hedge funds who look through SEC filings, looking for opportunities to demand a change in company strategy. So, and that strategy has to do with payout structure, right? So this letter, in a sense, is trying to attack these activist investors. And then if you look at another iconic letter, by BlackRock. Now, and you know, they control over $1 trillion in funds in the market, so their letters are really important. So basically, what BlackRock is doing here is they are basically writing. So this is interesting, right? So the very people who would want more money to come out, they're basically saying that actually we think it's gone too far, right? We think it's gone too far, and it sends the wrong signal, because if interest rates in the economy are as low as nearly zero, and companies are busy returning cash, then that means the companies are telling shareholders that we are clueless. We don't have ideas. Because, I mean, if you're returning cash to the shareholders, for the shareholders to put their money in treasury bills, right, in accounts which do not give any kind of interest, you're telling them that you, who have been appointed to manage their resources, are clueless. You're telling them that you cannot identify, with all your education, all your training, all your experience, you cannot identify projects that are NPV positive. And that must be, in a sense, disappointing to shareholders. And that's the background, right? So you see, and why are they saying this? They're saying this because they're looking at an aggregation of all the share buybacks going on in the market. Massive amounts have been returned. We're talking here, they give a figure of about 900 billion. That's a lot of money. So if you look there, it says in 2014, dividends and buybacks alone totaled more than 900 billion. And they say here that there is nothing wrong in returning. Sorry. There is nothing wrong. Okay. There's nothing wrong in returning capital to shareholders in a measured way. The problem, though, is that we need to ask, to whom do we owe duties? Or a better way to ask that question would be, you know, what sort of interest do we consider? Do we consider the interest of an activist investor who simply takes a position in the share register of a company for a few minutes? Or do we consider long-term shareholders, right? And you see that being dealt with here. And essentially, they basically then say, you know, that we will now take an interest in how firms formulate their policy on payouts from the corporate treasury. Right, so if you look further down, so we have revised our proxy voting guidelines to make clear our expectations of boards and set out when we may vote against directors, such as instances when we see evidence of board entrenchment or other signs of ineffective governance. Right? So ineffective governance will include this. Right? So you can see that this is a highly contested area. Right? So and so what I've just done is simply show some of the debates surrounding this. But if you look at deals in the market, I mentioned the February deal involving Rio Tinto, which is in the mineral sector. They basically, right, announcing returns of $13.5 billion US, including a dividend of 3.1 and a special dividend of 4 billion. Now, the corporate lawyer has to ask, how do we package it? Why do you think they have to split it? Right? You know, why couldn't they just sort of aggregate everything and just give shareholders? Why do you use a special dividend? Why do you do a share buyback? Why do you use other structures, which we'll talk about? So those are some of the issues that we'll be looking at. And then if you look at the, this was late last year, I think around October, November last year, November here. Okay, so the press release, okay. So here you see BHP announcing 10 billion, a 10 billion shareholder return program. Right, so these are tremendous sums of money that people are given. And the idea basically is just to give you an overview of some of the sizes and also how to go about it. Here, again, you'll notice that it takes the form of a share buyback, right? At least a part of it takes the form of a share buyback. And then, you know, and if you look at off-market share buybacks, you'll see that they carry a lot of risks. Did anybody watch the film? That was a movie. You didn't watch it? I think I gave in one of the seminars. You remember the clip involving a Luger 45. So it starts out by talking about a Luger 45, and there's an attempt by somebody to buy shares in a company, and then he's asking for the company to buy him out. Michael Douglas.
Wall Street?
Yeah, the Wall Street. Yeah. It starts with a conversation about a Luger 45, which is, you know, a gun and all that, and then you talk about, you know, there was that conversation about buying them out. The reason I mention that is that it is done, in that case it was done off market, and that's why he was able to mention his own price. In other words, there are less protections if you do it off market. All right, so having said that, let's kind of go back to the seminar. Now, again, if one thing I always say, if you look, we have two main books on corporate finance, right, in the UK, corporate finance law in the UK, and the other book does not deal with this topic at all, and that's the fatter book. And yet, this is really an important aspect of what goes on in the market. So if you go to Clifford Chance or Freshfields and all that, you go to the corporate section or Herbert Smith, the discussions, you know, would be around these kinds of deals. It's not going to be about the Section 33 contract, or, you know, do you understand? Or the nature of a share. Nobody talks about the nature of a share because they use it instrumentally. So they'll be talking about these deals, these structures, right? So your ability to be able to apply it becomes critical. So, however, Ferren spent about 10 pages talking about it. And if you notice, when you turn to Ferren, and you'll see that, again, and this is my bugbear with the topics in corporate finance, there's a big demarcation between law in the books and law in action. And I think, you know, if we can bridge that gap, you know, we'll go a long way in making, certainly making the academy more useful to people in practice. And I think the way to bridge this gap is A, to know what goes on in practice, and B, to look at the academic literature in business schools, you know. So it has to be interdisciplinary. Right? It has to be interdisciplinary because if you look at the literature from business schools, for instance, there was a paper from the Harvard Business Review, which, right, buybacks really shortchanging. This, I'll upload some of these things to Keats, right? I didn't want this to overwhelm you initially. I just thought I'll introduce this, so I'll upload it. So basically, you know, here you see this article in the Harvard Business Review, buybacks shortchanging investment, and they go into an analysis of the conventional arguments against buybacks, and, you know, i.e. that buybacks reduce R&D expenditure. That's a conventional argument. Buybacks reduce R&D expenditure. Buybacks reduce capital reinvestment. But they say, actually, that there's empirical evidence to suggest that when you do a buyback, the money comes back to the company. So the argument is that the money comes back to the company because people use the money, right, received, to buy more shares in the company. And they were able to identify that a lot of buybacks are often accompanied within short order. They're accompanied with capital raising. So the argument is that if you do a buyback, say, in January, and you do a capital raising in February, right, the same money that went out is also coming back. And so the argument is that in order to ascertain whether or not these buybacks actually affect firm value, you need to look, you need to be able to aggregate how much actually comes back. Do you see? So in a sense, there is a link between this topic and capital raising. And if you look at it just purely from a legal perspective, you will not link them, right? You simply just deal with share buybacks. But I think when you look at it from an interdisciplinary perspective, you'll see these linkages. Now, whether or not the linkage is established is a different matter. I mean, they tried to bring empirical evidence to support it. And it did seem very convincing that we cannot afford to discount those figures that actually come into the company, right, in different ways. Does anybody have any questions so far? Any questions? Okay. So we go back to first principles. We say you've raised capital, right? And your duty, the duty of management, is to promote the success of the company. When I say management, I mean the directors, right? If we're to be precise, the duty of management is not to promote the success of the company. You know this, because management work pursuant to contracts of employment for the company. So they have a duty of fidelity in the contracts of employment. It's the directors who have a duty to promote the success of the company. But obviously the directors appoint managers, and therefore they ensure that these guys promote the success of the company. Okay, so if the duty is to promote the success of the company for the benefit of the members as a whole, and profit arises, so profit now gets into that treasury box. The question is, what do we do with the profit? So the first question is, are shareholders entitled to the residual? There's a paper by Greenwood where he actually, the paper is uses that title. I think we're right. So Greenwood, he says the dividend puzzle. Are shareholders entitled to the residual? What do you think he's going to say? Even before reading, sometimes when you look at the title of a paper, you already know the agenda, right? And it's always good to, before you read a paper, it's always good to think about the agenda of the author. It makes reading easier, because if you think somebody has an agenda, you're actually more engaged. You're kind of saying, let me see where this guy or woman or whatever the case may be, you know what I mean. Where is this person going with this? So you're a bit more clued up, you're a bit more engaged, as opposed to just sort of picking up a paper, almost like a tabula rasa. You don't really know where the person is going. Then concentration is a bit difficult to maintain. So when you look at a paper like that, a title, what do you think the person, where do you think the person is going? The question itself tells us, shareholders are called the residual claimants, aren't they? And this person is putting a question mark. Are shareholders entitled to residual? So this person is attacking the orthodox position. That's what the person is doing. They're attacking the orthodox position. How can you ask the question, are residual claimants entitled to the residual? You would only ask this question if you intend to bring the entire citadel down. You really want to demolish the entire structure, so that you begin to look at shareholders and workers as the same, right? So you then say, and somehow, I don't think shareholders should be entitled to the residual. What about workers, employees, right? You know, why should shareholders have the decision? That would be the argument. And so now, what does this then mean? So even before reading the paper, we can work this out. I can pull out the paper in a minute, and but I think you guys can check it out yourselves. But they're not going to say that workers should decide whether or not a dividend should be paid. Instead, they would say the directors should be the ones, right? And when the directors decide this, the directors need to balance the interests of shareholders with the interests of workers, and not to prioritize the interests of shareholders over and above the interests of workers. In other words, in a practical sense, what this means is that 900 billion you're pushing out to shareholders, you probably need to keep it and say, do we build more plants? Do we pay more money to our employees? Do we spend more money training the employees? That's where they're going. What do you think? What do you think? I mean, does anybody
I think we might find the answer in section 172 when it says that directors should promote the success of the company for the benefit of its member as a whole.
yes, and yeah.
Preferring shareholders. I mean, putting shareholders first.
Okay, but I suppose the question is a normative question, isn't it? So the person is not really concerned about it. This is your law you've told us about. He's more interested in attacking the law. They're not interested in it, right? So that's the paper. Right? So everyone knows that shareholders receive dividends because they're entitled to the residual returns of a public corporation. Everyone is wrong, right? And I show that shareholders have no special claim on corporate economic returns. No one has an entitlement to rents in a capitalist system. This is the kind of paper that Ocasio would have written if she knew enough corporate law. Or Elizabeth Warren. All right? You know the Ocasio-Cortez who doesn't want people to fly but flies planes and doesn't want people to have children or eat cows. Anyway, so no one has entitlement to rents in a capitalist system. Shareholders are purely fungible providers of a purely fungible commodity and are particularly unlikely to be able to command a share of economic profits or any rent at all. You know, shareholders do win much of the corporate surplus, but this is not by market right or moral entitlement. You know, you can see where this is going, isn't it? You can see where this is going. And the left will love this kind of paper, right? You need to get a corporate lawyer who goes rogue, right? So a corporate lawyer who goes rogue and tries to demolish settled corporate law principles. Now, but obviously in the academia, as we are, we've got to respect it and engage with it. So the fact that I'm sort of slagging it out doesn't mean, I'm just being provocative. It doesn't mean my heart, well, you kind of know where my heart lies anyway. But anyway, what do you think? What do you think? Because ultimately, that is one of the questions we would have to deal with. And for some reason, let's see. Okay, so here, that question posed is a question that we will come back to, which is partly this. What proportion of profits should be paid out to shareholders? But actually, it's even a larger question than the proportion, the question about the proportion. It goes to whether shareholders are entitled. Right, so that would be the first question I think we need to ask, and I hope that, we'll reflect on this as we go along. And then the second question is what I just looked at, which is what proportion should be paid out to shareholders? How much should the company retain for reinvestment? And what is the relationship, if any, of dividend policy to firm value? So in answering this question, I'd like us to look at it from a legal and normative perspective. In other words, what does the law say now, and what ought the law to say? Right, because there are two aspects. What do you think the law says now? I'm referring to the second question. What proportion should be paid out to shareholders? Does the law say anything or not? No. The law does, actually. The law does say something. If you look at the jurisprudence on section 994 to 996, you'll see that the law does say something, and I do mention this. If you are locked into a company, and the company does not pay out any dividends, right? We have cases like Risamwela, which basically says that, and I'll show you the case, which basically says that this could be considered to be unfairly prejudicial conduct, right? So if you're locked into a company, right, which would be the case with every non-traded company, and the dividends are not paid, then certainly in Risamwela, the court said that itself is unfairly prejudicial conduct. Now, when you go to court under Section 994 of the Companies Act, you're going to court not because of a violation of your rights. You have no rights. That's why you are in 994. If you had a right, you'll bring a direct action. Exactly. So a right would be, I want to vote. I have a right to vote, and they lock me out and say, don't come in. Right? So that would be an infringement of your right to vote, and you should be able to sue directly. But if what has happened is that no dividend has been paid to you, and, you don't have a right to a dividend. The law simply says that dividends should be paid from distributable profits, right? And we know how to measure that. But the law does not go a stage further to say you have a right, unless, of course, you have preference shares with a preferential right to a dividend, right? Because then you have a clear coupon, right? So in that case, if you have preference shares with, say, a 2% dividend right, so long as there are dividends, right? So long as there are distributable profits, then you have a right to be paid. And in that case, you can sue. But we're talking about somebody who is just an ordinary shareholder in a company, locked into that company. You have no right, and that's why you go under 994, asking the court to intervene. You're saying to the court, I have no right, but I have an interest, right? So because an interest does not rise to the level of a right, right? So I have an interest, and that interest has been unfairly prejudiced. Previously, the struggle initially was purely doctrinal, which was, how could you say it was unfair if it affected everybody? You see, the very idea of unfairness is discrimination. If everybody suffered together equally, then it's not unfair. So we suffer prejudice, but it's not unfair prejudice. But you see the courts, certainly in Samuela, struggling with this, and then basically saying, well, we just think it's unfair, and therefore you should be able to get a remedy under 994. But then the question then is, how do we balance your entitlements to a remedy under 994 with the notion that managers are best placed to pilot the corporate enterprise, and judges should not be there to interfere. You think about it. People are going into business school to study capital structure decisions, to study how what kind of payout ratio to use, right? Whether a payout actually adds value to a firm. Right? That's what people are studying in business school. And you, the judge, who have never been to the campus of any business school, can't read a balance sheet. You basically are making a determination and are saying that I want to make capital structure decisions for a firm. Now that's pretty remarkable. And that's why judges generally do not want to get involved in such determinations. Right? So, but your answer is, the answer you volunteered earlier is correct as regards the public company. So if a company is publicly traded and no dividend is paid, then yeah, you can leave. You can leave. You know. And an economist would say, or a financial corporate finance specialist would say, actually you don't need to leave, because if the company is doing well, right, the dividend not paid out is increasing firm value. Yeah, so unless, of course, you believe that by not paying out a dividend, the firm has free cash flow, and free cash flow is usually a harbinger of agency cost. You know that, because, I mean, when a company has free cash flow, that's when the private jets increase, right? That's when you have more money for private jets, corporate, all manner of corporate enjoyment, golf courses, such like, right? So it's free cash flow. So the idea is that, so some people say that if you don't pay out, you actually are creating room for agency costs. So the devil will be in the detail, presumably. So, that's another question. Then the third question is there any relationship between return methods and corporate governance? So here we're looking at the return methods. So for instance, is there a relationship between a special dividend and as a method compared to, let's say, a share buyback, right? As a method, and corporate governance. Why would you use one as opposed to the other? And I'll just give you an example of. So here, I'm just giving examples of different types of return. Here they're using a B share. Here they're using a tender offer, right? Here they're doing a special dividend, right? And in the Melrose deal, they're using a new holding company structure, right? And I think I do explain the Melrose deal, right? So I explained the Melrose deal by taking the structure, the new holding company structure, and then trying to sort of explain what is going on, right? So the question really is there any relationship between return methods and corporate governance? Can you think about it?
Be like trying to keep the shareholders happy with your certain return methods, like having a certain dividend policy, so you're like playing into them, not replacing you ever, and they will think you're a great manager.
Yeah, but we're not talking about the amounts you give out or whether or not you give out. We're talking about the method. So would some methods have a greater corporate governance effect than others? So you get the point. So assuming you give out, the issue is not in the giving out or in the amount you give out, but in the method. What do you think? we'll come to that. Maybe when we start talking about the methods, then you'll be able to. I mean, I know you already know some methods, but I presume you'd like to know about, say, the new holding company structure method and all that, right? Before you volunteer an answer. And then the other one is, how are the decisions communicated to the market and shareholders? So here, you know, the Financial Reporting Council has emphasized that your payout policy, right, should not be ad hoc, because they feel that, in a sense, sometimes you're trying to do it to bribe shareholders. So let people know up front what you intend to do. And that's why I gave you an example of the payout policy of Rio Tinto. So if you look further down, so if you look at the Rio Tinto document, you'll see that they put forward their payout policy. They basically say that the board expects total cash returns to shareholders to be in the range of 40 to 60% of underlying earnings, right? And the board is committed to maintaining an appropriate balance of cash returns to shareholders in the business. So essentially what you see here is the board communicating upfront to say, this is what we will do. Now, some people would say that this is the better way of doing it, as opposed to using a special dividend. You see, a special dividend is very ad hoc. And so people say that when you do it, it may reveal a corporate governance problem. So maybe you think you're going to be subject to a takeover, right? You think a takeover bidder is going to come. Then, so what do? You quickly announce a special dividend, right? So when you announce a special dividend, the idea basically is that because it's so ad hoc, because it's not embedded in the context of an existing policy, this could actually be against shareholder value. So although shareholders are being given something, it's against shareholder value. And that, I mean, what do you think about that argument? Obviously, if you're in the position of a shareholder, you ain't going to mind a special dividend, right? If it's a hefty one. But if you're sort of a bit disconnected from it, do you think that it reveals something good about the company? Would you be happy with the company? If you had two companies, one that did special dividends every now and then that you couldn't really predict, and another one like this that had a stable policy, which one would you invest in? And assuming, let's even put it this way, assuming you're kind of looking at their track record in the last 5 years, and each company paid out the same amount in the end, right? As a proportion to earnings, right? So they all paid out the same, but one was ad hoc, and the other one was a bit more structured. Who would you invest in?
I would actually prefer the ad hoc, because you know that it's not only because of policy, that you actually know that the management is paying the excess cash flow or whatever, and they are not just doing it even though they are making losses and whatever, that they are.
Yeah.
That they're actually doing it because.
Okay, that's an interesting point. I mean, what do you think? So, because he's saying that if you have a structure, that could tie your hands, right? But okay, I was hoping somebody would say to you, if you make losses, you won't be able to pay a dividend in the first place. Otherwise, we'll be joking in this class, right? That means we're not.
We saw this point with, for example, with the Lehman Brothers right before they crashed, where they obviously made a lot of losses.
Yeah.
But they still kept out paying billions of.
Yeah. Sorry.
I would prefer the structured form because it's more predictable for you as a shareholder, especially if you want to leave the company. You would know that they pay out the dividend at day X, and not you leave the company and like a few days later the new shareholder gets the dividend.
Exactly. So it's more, you can plan.
Yeah.
And also, is it not an indication that they are responding to something we don't know, right? So in the ad hoc one, they've seen something that you and I, the widows and orphans in the company, are not aware of. So maybe they've gotten wind that a takeover bidder may be interested in the company. So what do? They try to discourage the takeover bidder by paying a dividend, right? Now, I know. Do you think? I mean, takeover law, we say you're not allowed to take frustrating action. Do you think the payment of a dividend could be regarded as frustrating action? Yeah.
I think it can, because when it stops the bidder from proceeding with the takeover, a takeover can be in the interest of the shareholder. If they would get good money for their shares, they might choose to leave the company during this takeover. So
Yeah.
if the directors decide to kind of block it.
But are the directors blocking it though? They're not. Are they blocking it? If the directors pay out a dividend to you, the shareholders, how are they blocking the bidder?
The value of the company goes down.
Yeah.
If you pay out to the shareholders, it's not in the company anymore.
Yes.
It's not an investor or an investor.
Yes. So essentially, what you're doing is you're discouraging the bidder from proceeding with the bid. You're actually right. If you look at Rule 21 of the Takeover Code, you'll see that the payment of a dividend outside the ordinary course of business is regarded as frustrating action. All right? So it is regarded as frustrating action because, in a sense, what you've done is to prevent the bidder from proceeding because you've made the target less attractive. And even though I said the money was paid to the shareholders, that's really a red herring. I wanted to see whether she would fall for it. But she refused to fall for it. And she said, ultimately what you're doing is you're taking an asset away from the company and thereby making the target less attractive. I mean, the slight problem is that the frustrating action test or rule focuses not on the bidder, but on the target. So the issue is not the frustration of the bidder, but the frustration of the target. But I think in this case, you clearly have frustrated the target shareholders. Even though you've given shareholders of the target money, by giving them money, you've also frustrated them because you've provided a disincentive to a would-be bidder. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, if you do, say, a special dividend of 10 billion to prevent the takeover, wouldn't the bidder just offer 10 billion less? Or like, because it's the same company with, 10 billion less of value.
Yeah. So that's the argument would be that that in a sense the market will correct it, right? So because if you pay out a huge amount of money from the company, then in a sense there should be a repricing of the shares of the target company, right? And if there's a repricing, then the bidder, I mean, if it's an existing bidder, the existing bidder will find it difficult to reduce the price, right? Once you started the takeover, because the regulatory system basically ties you to the price. But obviously, if the bid hasn't started, right, and you're in the drawing board, you can go back and revise whatever price. But normally, from a tactical perspective, if you start with a particular price, you want to do it in such a way that you can go up, but usually not to go down. So that would be the slight problem you would face. So the idea basically is that there is a link between your payout formula and how you communicate it to shareholders and issues of corporate governance. And that's what we've seen. And then finally, we talk about a practical issue. So this practical issue is really in the domain of corporate lawyers. So many of the other issues we've been looking at are the sort of issues that you'll deal with in business school, right? But when it comes to now structuring it, right, they have to come to meet us to do it, right? Because no matter how much you go to a business school, you're not going to know how to use a scheme of arrangement, right? Or to create a B share. So, and in using this, we go back to basics. We go back to existing rules we've studied and then use them instrumentally. You'd have noticed that this has tended to be a motif of this course. I've kept on emphasizing that we should not approach the law in isolation. We should see the law in the context of a wider goal, i.e., we should see the law instrumentally.
May I ask a question?
Please do,
Like,
yeah.
it's just an introductionary question for us, because for us who haven't had the corporate governance part, would you mind saying what this means with, like, for the benefit of its members? Does it mean that they have to look at the shareholders' interest, like in your promote the success of the company for the benefit of its members as a whole?
Yeah, for the benefit of the membership of the company, but taking into cognizance or in having regard to other interests within the company. So in other words, you're focused on the residual claimants, but in being focused on the residual claimants, you need to take into account the community, the workers, the reputation of the company, right? So it's what we call the enlightened shareholder value idea, right? The enlightened shareholder value. So before the 2006 Companies Act, you had two schools of thought. You had sort of the Greenwood type people who basically said, why should it always be about shareholders? And then you have the business people. Now, the people in government actually were the business people. I remember going to a conference where somebody from the Department of Business then, gave a talk. And I still remember the talk. This is like years ago. And he was saying that ultimately, for everything we do, we have to apply a discounted cash flow, a DCF analysis. And the DCF analysis, right, and the way he explained what they were doing in terms of valuation of business projects, focused on the return, right, to the company. So in other words, they were looking at the bottom line. They were not looking at wider things, right? So they were not looking at the polar bears. They were looking at how much money do we get in the end. Now, obviously, reputation is a key aspect of that, right? Sustainability is a key aspect of that. But once you keep your eyes focused on the bottom line, then that sort of narrows the debate. Now, it became pretty clear early in the day when the DTI was coming up with various documents leading to the 2006 Act, where they were going to go. But remember, the left wing, right, is also strong. So they needed to come up with a solution that placated them. So the way they did it was a fudge by saying, literally all roads lead to Rome. We can bring the two together, right? We collapse these two separate things together and have one, and simply say that the duty of management, the duty of the directors, is to promote the success of the company. Now, who can quarrel with that? To promote the success of the company. How do you define success? Then they say, well, the bottom line. Well, the bottom line, that's success. So what's the bottom line? Residual claimants. But how do you achieve that? Let's have regard to reputational issues. Who can quarrel with that? Let's have regard to the environment, right? And all that, right? So to that extent, you then get an amalgam of these two.
I think, to just pursue the maximization of the wealth of the company.
Yeah.
What's left is for the shareholders, as residual claimants.
Yes, after dealing with the other claims.
Exactly.
Yeah. Because at the end of the day, the employees are going to get their fixed claims. You're not going to pay the employees more than their fixed claims. You're not going to give creditors more than their fixed claims, right? So what remains at the end of the day goes to the residual claimants. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions? Okay.
Can you still consider a frustrating action paid out of dividends, distributable profits? I mean, you're talking about huge, massive paid out dividends, distribution of dividends, but what if you're doing it lawfully, in a lawful manner, out of distributable profits?
Yeah.
Can you still consider it frustrating action, like according to your previous example?
Yes. The answer is yes. And I want to show you how. Yeah. So the answer to that question is yes, and the reason why it has to be yes is because if the dividend is unlawful, then it's really not a dividend, right? It's unlawful. So that itself is even worse. Here we're dealing with where we have to assume the dividend is lawful. But then if we assume the dividend is lawful, we're looking at the depletion of the assets of the company. Now, the problem here is that the depletion goes to the shareholders. So some people would say, well, how could this be frustrating, right? But and because the legal rule focuses on frustration of the shareholders, not frustration of the bidder, right? Because the shareholders need to be able to exercise sovereignty, right? And if you prevent them from exercising sovereignty, then in a sense you frustrated them. But the argument would be, and I'm sure that's the argument you have in mind, that by depleting the company of an asset, even if the destination is the shareholders, you have discouraged the bidder. And by discouraging the bidder from bringing forth a bid, you have ultimately affected shareholder sovereignty. Right? Do you see? You've affected shareholder sovereignty because shareholders at the end have not been the one to decide whether or not the bid works. It has been management. Right? So if you look at Rule 21, what I was just trying to do was to look at Rule 21 of the Takeover Code. So that's a note to, if you look at note 3, the declaration and payment of an interim dividend by the operating company, otherwise than in the normal course. So that would be a special dividend, right? Right, because it's ad hoc, right? During an offer period may, in certain circumstances, be contrary to General Principle 3 and this rule, in that it could effectively frustrate an offer, right? And the relevant rule is the rule on frustrating action in Rule 21. So that's a note. So it doesn't appear in the rule itself. You need to look at the notes. Okay, so I think I can proceed. Okay, so we've talked about those 5 key issues. I should also mention that one of the things Donald Trump did was to reduce the tax code as regards corporate entities in America from 35 to 21%. So that's a big drop, and also the reduced tax to enable companies like Apple that had tons of money abroad to repatriate the money back home has led to companies being, awash with funds. And, and whether you like it or not, regardless of its politics, this is obviously having an effect. I mean, the deficit is still large. However, more money is being pumped into companies. Hence, employment figures are getting higher, right? Much to the dismay of the left, right? Because, Obama could never have reduced corporation tax from 35 to 21%. Hell will freeze over for him to have done that, right? Because, he comes from a different political wing. So this basically tells you that there is a lot of cash. Now, the real problem then for the corporate lawyer is how to return this cash, because you have to do it in a tax-efficient way also, right? And that's why, for instance, you use the B share, because when you use a B share, you enable shareholders to exercise a right of election as to whether or not they receive a capital receipt or an income receipt. We all know that income is taxed more than capital, right? So a capital gain, right, is not as taxed as income. And so if you create a B share, so let me just simplify it. Imagine you want to give somebody £1,000. You want to give somebody £1,000. And the person says, well, I don't want to pay income tax on that £1,000. I'd rather pay capital gains, right? Because it's less. So the question then is, how do you then structure it? If you give him £1,000, he has to pay income tax, right? So corporate lawyers will come and say, you know something, we have studied corporate finance, we know how to do this. We will use a share premium account, right, which has the nature of capital, right? So we'll take all that money in a share premium account, which has the nature of capital, and then capitalize it, right? Right, we capitalize it, so that becomes part of share capital, and then issue shares to people. Now, remember, you want to give him money, you don't want him to give you money, right? Remember, you need to give him money, not the other way around. But the law says if you give him a share, he has to pay for it, remember? You have to pay for shares, and you can't issue the shares at a discount. But if you use, so we're thinking instrumentally now, but we also know that if we use a bonus share, then he doesn't need to pay for it, right? Remember? So we give him a bonus share, and therefore he doesn't need to pay for this bonus share. And then what do? We design the bonus share, so we go back to that seminar on the design of shares. We design the bonus share in such a way that it only serves one and only one purpose, and that purpose is simply for us to stream money to him. So in other words, the bonus share will have no right to vote, right? It's just really for us to stream money. So we build into the bonus share a right of election, which is you, the holder of the bonus share, can choose to elect that when your share is being redeemed by the company, when the share is being redeemed by the company or bought back by the company, you have a right to choose whether the company should treat it as a capital receipt or as an income receipt. So if you choose that it be treated as a capital receipt, when the company now, because remember you've got a bonus share, so the company now wants to give you this £1,000, it then gives you the £1,000 by redeeming the share, right? But because you've elected for it to be a capital receipt, right, then you can say to the tax man, this is a capital gain, not an income gain. You pay less, right? So, and the way we've done this, notice the way we've done this, right, in very simple terms, is just apply all the things we studied earlier. So remember again, let's just go over it again. The company has lots of cash, so imagine Imagine it's a UK company, right? It suddenly has lots of cash. The question for the managers is, what do we do with all this cash? Some people on the board are saying, if you keep the cash and you can't invest the cash, well, a corporate bidder will come. They'll take over the company. You're going to attract a bidder, and we're going to have no job, right? So we need to quickly pay it out. And then somebody on the board says, guess what? The quicker you pay it out, the better, because if there's no offer period, then it's not frustrating action, right? If there's an offer period and you then do the payout, then it becomes frustrating action. So guess what? Everybody's rushing to pay out this money before an offer period starts. So then some of my shareholders say, well, if you're going to pay out this money, I don't want you to worsen our tax position, right? So because I don't want to pay income tax on this money. Then they come back to you and you say, okay, so how do we structure it? Then we say, okay, let's find a way, instead of doing a rudimentary return of cash in the form of a dividend or in the form of a special dividend, let us do it in a slightly different way. And that would be to give them a piece of paper that the law says they have to buy, they have to pay for, because when you give them shares, they have to pay for it. But we can bypass that if we use a bonus share. And if we use a bonus share, you don't pay for a bonus share, remember? You don't pay. It's a capitalization issue. You don't pay for it. And then we can tell the taxman that because the money came from the share premium account, it had the nature of capital. So because it had the nature of capital, when we take that capital and give it to the shareholder, and how do we give the capital to the shareholder? By redeeming the share in his pocket, right? Then when he gets that money, it's a capital receipt. So in this example, what we've done is we've designed the share. So remember that seminar on the configuration of shares? We've had to design the share for the share to allow us to do what we're doing. Right? So that's the first thing we did. Two, we went to the seminar on payment for shares. And chose a share that you don't pay for, right? And then 3, we then went to the seminar on redemption of shares, right? And that's what that's what we've basically done, to redeem the shares. And essentially, we've basically been able to deliver value, right? And all we've just done is go to old rules we studied, and we applied them in an instrumental way to bring about this outcome, right? So,
Can I ask a question to this?
yes.
Because this, in your example, it's about moving the capital from the share premium. So what do you do when you don't have substantial amounts of capital in your share premium and you only have them as profits? Can you just move them?
No, then the taxman will not allow you. So you need to, the HMRC would say, well, this fund, is not capital.
So then you can't do
Then you can't do this. Then that means you'd have to look for other ways, right? Right. So. And that's why some companies will always try to keep. Why do you think some companies have like over $1 billion in the share premium account? And why would they leave $1 billion in a share premium account? Remember when we looked at the Liberty transaction? They did a reduction of capital and they had over $1 billion in the share premium account. That's because it enables you to do things like this, right? So you can see how these things kind of come together. Now, before we take a break, I just want to just flag up something which I should have mentioned. Because what I've done is to show 2 dimensions. I've said there is the normative issue, there's the practical issue. We just talked about a practical issue now, right? I know when we're talking about a normative issue, you guys are like almost going to bed, very sleepy. Then the practical issue, how to make money, suddenly everybody wakes up, right? Okay. But there's also a third issue, and that is the global relevance. You know, when I do research, I always try to do interdisciplinary. I always like to know what people are saying in other disciplines. You know, and this is one area where, if you look at the financial journals, most of the papers being published are in this area, different jurisdictions. So here, you see the International Review of Financial Analysis looking at Thailand, China, you know, literally everywhere. There's so much research on this. It's a big issue. And the interesting thing is that both emerging markets and developed markets, there's a ton of data. Right? So, I just thought that that's something to bear in mind. Obviously, what we're looking at now is the question of how transactions are structured using the rules, which I term tools. And that's basically what we're seeing. We're seeing it as a tool. So hopefully, after your break, we will continue. So if you take a 10-minute break now, and then we come back to look at this.
One paragraph, yeah, go.
Because there are, like when you read the literature, there's a lot of feeling mixed with the religious aspect, with the legal aspect. Like it's always like things that religion, like I mean, they can not mention like the Roman Empire, the whole because there were other times like the whole the Roman so you have to mention it because like there was a decade in Eastern Church, it wasn't just separated like it was still the same church until the
Are you talking about the Orthodox?
yes, but it was like
Still
at the fall of the Western
I'm good. Okay. We also
Where are you going this time?
in a very, very peak. The same way they are
We're doing it in the 28th.
You guys. The one you're putting in the basement somewhere.
It's a good
What's he
idea.
getting? Peppermint tea?
the last time I took it, chocolate sauce.
Oh, I didn't eat alcohol. And this.
It was
I think English.
But it got
In the bread, like a rose petal. Like it can go really well or really bad.
Yeah, I've seen these also dinner tours. They have travel buses, and they are almost always.
my card. It's like, it's not even putting my card in. I don't know.
Yeah, really. Let me just take it out.
Oh, oh.
Oh, so it's just like warranty?
Yeah. Oh, okay, it's okay.
Yeah, I can book the tour. I think mine, I should have enough money on my account.
Yeah, it's not like I can do it.
English is sure.
Oh, we can cook our own. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's good.
Oh, okay.
Okay, just another link. Yeah, it's definitely link.
So that we're
Very rare today.
I'm very rare.
Are you going to the cafe today or why?
No. This is not red.
what the hell?
Yes, it matches both colors on my scarf.
What about the boots?
They are black because they match my coat.
Black coat. Go all in.
With the red coat?
With a red coat. You are mocking my sweater. The only red thing that I'm wearing is a sweater, and you're laughing at it. And you want me to bring a red
No,
coat.
I'm just.
Which I own. I call you Red Riding Hood. I do have a red coat, and then bring it. So in between the neutral, the ones that I couldn't put in.
Then we
Just
can
go to
fit into the crowd.
go to the line. It's perfect. All pink, red. What?
I think I will use her own time because I have always watched Game of Thrones until season 5. So. Yeah, we can work now.
Is it expensive?
It's just 15 pounds, which...
And then you get cake and tea?
No, we are planning 2 different things at the same time. We're going on a tea time and tomorrow we're going to...
We are multitasking.
Oh.
So, but you...
What's the Cambridge tour?
We're visiting Cambridge.
We're going to
Like
Cambridge
this?
on Saturday.
Oh,
We're
you're
leaving at
all
8 in the
like-
morning and coming back at 8
Is it an event?
No, we're just going to Cambridge and see the town.
to visit.
I'd like to see that as well.
Take the girlfriend.
Switzerland. I feel like I cannot take the whole day off.
Why not?
And there's too much study.
Yeah, just
You should bring her sometime so that we can meet her properly. I have a friend who's coming over this weekend as well, so maybe we can also have some Yeah, but my girlfriend is there again.
sorry.
Yeah, I feel like I already started the evening.
But Friday is like not so good because Monica has planning and her favorite.
Friday being tomorrow.
Yes.
But don't you have to hand it in at 6?
I have to have it even before 6, like at 4 at the latest, because I have a lecture from 5 to 7. So I have to
No, I think it would be nice to go if you want to. Like I have my friend over, so I think we are going out somewhere.
so we're booking the Cambridge University and City Walking Park.
During study night. Quite nice in Cambridge.
invite them. Like they just prepare dinner for you and your friends, and you just get really nicely dressed, and then they are service to get a lot of
That sounds very awesome.
yeah. Well, we need to tie down. But I think you didn't like to explicitly say everyone books for a high salary.
We're booking it at 11 a.m. right?
There are 9,786 places left. We should really worry about it. So it's the 9th and 11th.
They also have free walking tours, but in order to enter in college campus, it's like £9. I think it is. Okay, I can go back and check, but I'm pretty sure I saw. Yeah, it's here. In addition to visiting the tour, we'll also cover. In addition to visiting the college,
Saturday, last fuel in the morning.
It's kind of like afternoon late afternoon. So I mean, if I'm free in the morning,
I mean, if not, it would just make sense to.
I can ask my girlfriend.
Did you create an account?
So she said, oh, so I did say, she had like, I think she has some good jobs.
Stavo uscendo dalla il mio esame. Senti, guarda la deadline soprattutto. La deadline tra 15 giorni. Una domanda di organizzamento che ancora non abbiamo trattato. Marzo. Lui mi ha mandato questa mail. Tu guardi il calendario, marzo, aprile e maggio, l'unico dei due che non ha degenerazione. No, ancora abbiamo parlato, perché non ha detto che la deadline era sbagliata, ha detto che si è reso conto che leggendo la domanda io non posso rispondere di più, perché la prima parola è non finance, che non finance, chi ha fatto non finance? Mi ha detto, in realtà, permettendo che questo va al di fuori di quello che noi eravamo già d'accordo, perché doveva essere io che però vabbè ci sta come lo vuoi dire. Cioè la domanda in realtà sarebbe quali sono i rischi? Vabbè, ma io sono messi in chiuso via allora. Io lo farei non fa, non lo fa.
when she did her undergrad, so there's nothing besides the
Di modo che però parla molto della settimana in cui.
and Saturday
Ma infatti l'intenzione
and she's
come
already
parla
leaving mid Sunday, so
sulla donna, quella che non si
yeah.
Cioè il punto è che non è quali sono i rischi che hai quando presti o ricevi capitale, se sei di rischio però cioè noi facciamo una lezione prima ma non c'è niente.
Okay, yeah.
In relation to the last case, is a reduction and the buyback arrangement will result in the same taxation treatment, the capital gain treatment.
So if you do a redemption,
Yeah.
and so in a sense, your question is that,
Both way will result in the capital gain.
yeah, because there are two different ways. There are two different ways of getting cash to people, right? So you could structure it as a share to be bought back, right? Now, if the share you're buying back, right, is capitalized through the share premium account, it's capital, right? So all that you've just done is it's a different method. You're doing a share buyback. Then a redemption is also a different method, but at the end of the day, you're still getting share, you're still getting cash to the recipient. Do you get it? So the method you use does not determine the tax outcome, right? The bottom line is what you are redeeming or buying back, right? Because that is really what's determinative. Okay.
And another question is that is this arrangement involved in the public company or just in the private company? Because the share premium is part of the distributable share.
Yeah, so it applies to both. As you know, if you look at section 610, which deals with the obligation to set up a share premium account, it is an undistributable reserve as far as all companies are concerned. The share premium account is an undistributable reserve as far as all companies are concerned, right? Because if you look at section 610, which creates the obligation to create, or which imposes the obligation to create a share premium account, it does not make a distinction between public and private.
Because I think it's a kind of distribute the dividends.
Yeah. So two things. One, the obligation to create a share premium account applies to all companies, public and private. Secondly, as regards it being a distribution, right? The relevant rules on distribution, right, apply to public and private in this regard. The only difference between public and private is the obligation to take account of net unrealized losses, right? So if you remember when we looked at section 831, where we talked about the net asset test, and we identified undistributable reserves, the share premium account was there. It was there as one of the undistributable reserves. And I did say to you that, so what's the difference? What's the difference between this test as it applies to public and private companies? Because the undistributable reserve is undistributable even in the case of a private company, right? So the difference was not with the share premium account. It was with respect to item C on that list, which deals with unrealized losses. And that's why the table with the figures I gave you showed the difference between a public and private company as regards net unrealized losses. So did you get it? Okay. Yeah, so so one point I did mention is that in corporate finance people, when they talk about capital, these issues, they tend to talk about in the context of capital structure, right? And it would be remiss of me to teach this and not mention Modigliani and Miller, right? Because Modigliani and Miller basically did the famous work on capital structure. A paper published in 1961. They got a Nobel Prize for it. And basically, they said that the size of the pie is not increased or decreased by the type of claims you have. In other words, the ratio of debt to equity does not increase the size of the pie. In other words, firm value does not increase simply on account of your capital structure between debt and equity. And when they published this, business school, or at least before they published this, business school had spent an inordinate amount of time trying to analyze capital structure. This is what people basically studied, because it was almost like like the alchemist looking for that rare metal that can become gold, right? Everybody basically thought, if we get the balance right, we can increase value. And here comes Modigliani and Miller to say it does not increase firm value, it doesn't reduce it, unless of course the person put in if you take it as a pizza, the person putting the slices together probably has sticky fingers, and then maybe one slice goes out. But whether you put debt, equity, the ratio does not change firm value. But likewise, they also say your payout policy does not affect firm value, i.e., whether or not you pay dividends. So they call this the irrelevancy model, right? That it's irrelevant. Now, the truth is that in real world, right, we know it's relevant, right? Because if you're an ordinary company, you don't pay a dividend, you probably send the wrong signal to the market, and your share price will come down, right? Not all companies are like Amazon or Apple, right, who can afford not to pay. In the real world, people say your dividend policy is a way you send a signal to the market. And so they then say, well, the only reason why this model will make sense is if you hold true certain assumptions. So those assumptions would be that that there should be no taxes, right? So no taxes, because if you bring in taxes into the mix, we know that if you have debt in your capital structure, debt will be subject to a tax shield, right? If you have debt, and you pay interest on your debt, that interest is tax deductible, whereas dividends are not tax deductible. So immediately we see a difference. We can tell that equity, in a sense, is more expensive, right? Because it is not tax deductible. So in a sense, people then would say that, well, Modigliani and Miller's theory as regards the equity and debt side is it can only make sense in a perfect world where you have frictionless markets, no corporation taxes and such like. Likewise, on the other bit of the irrelevancy argument, the payout side, they would say, well, in the real world, if you go and run a company and don't pay dividends and see what the market would say, right? So here, so Modigliani and Miller argue that if certain assumptions hold, right, then dividend policy is irrelevant to payout. So dividend policy, rather, is irrelevant to share value, right? But obviously, those factors that they mention are factors which do not exist in the real world, right? And ultimately, they say that what determines firm value or share value is the NPV of the projects you invest in. So that's why I say here that leaving this perfect world of zero costs and descending into our world with its transaction cost, there are a number of reasons why a firm's dividend policy should have some influence or relation to share value. One would be the preferences of shareholders, right? And we've been talking about preferences at two levels. The shareholders, if shareholders want a payout and you don't give them a payout, then that could depress your share price, right? We've talked about that. But also we talked about preferences of shareholders in terms of how you structure it, right? The reality of taxation. And then see here, we talked about how capital gains led to the emergence of the B share. And this would be relevant to anybody from any typical Commonwealth jurisdiction where you have a share premium account, right? So like, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, right? This should be there. Then information asymmetry and the role of dividends as conveyors of information, right? So that sort of, is relevant to my point about the signaling effect of your payout policy. You basically, when you adopt a payout policy, you're putting your money where your mouth is. You're basically saying to the market that you can trust us on this. We will not waste free cash flow. Because whenever we get free cash flow and we have no clue about what to do with it, rather than build a new corporate office or buy a new Gulf Stream, we will divert that money to your pockets. And that's the argument here. So people like Easterbrook, right, have done work on this, and Fischel on this, basically showing that this is a very powerful form of corporate governance. And that ties in here. So you see the agency cost problem. Payout keeps owners happy and subject management to monitoring by the capital market. Because the moment you commit to paying out free cash flow, what does it mean? It means that whenever you have a project to do, you're prepared to go to the capital markets, right? You're prepared to borrow. And if you're prepared to borrow, as we'll see, then it means that you're prepared to sign, indenture agreements with all manner of warranties, all manner of covenants, right, which hold you to account. And anybody, if you compare covenants in debt financing to any other promise you made for equity financing, you'll know that debt covenants are more robust, right? You have, ratios being stipulated and all that. And so in a sense, anybody who's prepared to sign up to a debt covenant is really prepared to subject, or indeed is subjecting himself to the rigors of the capital market. So you might want to look at Easterbrook's paper, 2 agency cost explanations of dividends, right? And Laporte, Laporte and co, they've done a lot of work on why they think common law jurisdictions are generally better than civil law jurisdictions when it comes to capital formation. So part of the argument is that, one, there's more flexibility in common law jurisdictions, right? So look at what we just did with the share. How many civil law jurisdictions can make a share that malleable, right? Exactly, and that does assist you. Remember we talked about Ruritania. Remember the fictional country, but a real country? Remember at the beginning, we talked about that country that said, from the day of this Companies Act, all shares shall have 1 vote. That's crazy, but that's the country. And the country still has that law. And essentially, what that does is limit capital formation. So Laporte argued in this paper that dividend policies around the world in those jurisdictions where you have more payout reduces agency cost. And if they reduce agency cost, it means that capital formation is better. Now, we're not going to talk about this because we've talked about this. Remember, we talked about Risamuela, so the Risamuela is this. So essentially what I did, I went straight to Risamuela because that's where the meat is. You see Risamuela, the judge saying that Section 994 is not concerned with the consequences to the interests of those responsible for the unfairly prejudicial conduct, but with the consequences to the interests of those who complain. Remember the point I said earlier, that if you refuse to pay a dividend, the argument would be that how can this be unfair, right, when it affects everybody? And so Risamuela, the judge in Risamuela is saying that, well, 994 focuses on the consequences of the group who complain. We are not concerned with those who have brought it about, right? Because, you know, and this must be correct. The reason why they shouldn't be concerned about the people who have brought it about is that those guys do not rely on dividends. They are getting directors' fees. If you look at the facts of Samuela, right, you know, they ran a company for nearly 27 years, and they were collecting, you know, payouts in the form of directors' fees, and never paying dividends. So how can you then come to court and say, well, our refusal to pay a dividend, if it is prejudicial, cannot be unfairly so, because it affects us too. I mean, that just can't wash, right? You know, it only affects, I mean, it affects everybody, but for present purposes, there's a group we need to focus on. So that's why I went straight there.
But this only applies to private companies?
Yeah, well, yes, exactly.
994.
Exactly. So my point basically, if you go kind of back, so what I did here, you know, I try to state this rule by saying that, you know, if we accept, so it all depends on your starting point, if we accept that earnings of a company should be retained by management only if management has MPV projects in front of it, right? So, and the way we'll do this will be to look at a project with a rate of return higher than its WACC, its weighted average cost of capital. Exactly. So it will therefore follow that where no such projects have been identified, then the legal rule should be that you pay out. That's the way I phrased it. Do you get it? Right? So that's the question. That essentially you're saying that if you can't identify a project that promises a rate of return higher than your weighted average cost of capital, then return the money to the shareholders. Maybe shareholders have better ideas what to do with the money. So the question I then posed here was that, is this the legal standard? That's one question. Ought this to be the legal standard? Now, in regard to the question, is this the legal standard? I said the issue has not been directly confronted by the courts. The only area where it has been is in the Section 994 context, which, as you said, well, it applies to private companies and public companies so long as the public companies are not traded. Right? Okay? Then I said here that we could, however, ask ourselves the question, right, at a normative level, that should there be such a rule? Now, if you're going to ask the question, should there be such a rule, what would be the contours of this rule? How do we formulate this rule? One would be to say that we give members a say in this matter, right? So we say to members that you should be the ones to decide whether dividends are paid. So that could be one way. The other way could be using non-executive directors, right? Another one could be to say, well, we'll trust directors, but we'll use your business judgment, right? And fiduciary duties, right? Fiduciary standards, duty of care. And then we can tap from the oppression jurisprudence, but that would be limited to private or public companies which are non-traded. And then disclosure, right? And then I then reminded you about distributable profits in Section 829, which I'm not going to talk about, right? Because you already know this. And then here we say what methods exist, right? What methods exist. What I'd like you to, sorry, let me, so remember, in previous seminars, we've dealt with dividends, we've dealt with share buybacks, isn't it? So we know what dividends are, we know what share buybacks. So here you have the special dividend route using Ireland, right? The Ireland transaction. So you're going to see the Allen's document, which I mentioned. Essentially, the key thing to bear in mind with this particular document, it will be on Kate's, the key thing to bear in mind with the Allen's transaction is that the same law which applies to dividends applies to special dividends. The only difference is that you want the market not to hold you to account. So you're saying to the market it's a special dividend, right? So that way, this will not form part of your dividend history, right? Because management will be judged on that, right? Then the other one would be using the B share. So here, let's just we will stop here and we will continue. Hopefully by the time we meet, you would have looked at the transaction documents, right? Just especially the bits I've highlighted, right? And the bit that my notes on the Melrose deal. So I'm just going to look at the new holding company structure, which is the Melrose deal. It's on your seminar. You'll see I even summarized it. I put notes explaining it, so really that should be straightforward. And then the B share, just to take you through I've broken it down on your seminar sheet, but I'd like us to just look at the transaction document, so that if we spend, let's say, the first 15 minutes or 20 minutes of our next class on the transaction documents, it just brings it all together, right? Okay, thank you very much.
And the first thing he said is, this is very complicated, don't worry about it, it's not going to be on the
Can I ask you a quick question?
I'm trying to prepare for my next class. I have a class. I need to get things.
We dealt with the UK tax law, like the UK tax rules, but we also saw the rules
But I also have to go to the administrative office.
No, just send it and I'll do it. They'll send you a revised one.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah,
A quick question.
okay, a quick one because I have a class.
The open exam, can we just bring the code or we can bring the handout as well?
Yeah, you can bring out the handouts. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I'm trying to prepare for a class. I won't be able to see you today, but I got your message. Maybe I'll get back to you.
So we had like food and then talking with the things and I'm so happy that you guys are here.
Yeah.
Very good. I have
I'm skipping the 12 lunch today. Grabbing
he uploaded, I mean,
just getting
Non a caso i costi si chiamano guarda, io dopo
we have always German council, I mean, like, I can read the document. We are
Hello. Yeah, basically.
We'll be able to read the document in Spanish. So, I mean, he uploads, like he told us, you don't have to read everything, it's mostly for your information, like for your future if you want to have references to it. So he also, like, he tries to look for international sources, and a lot of times he just Googles it, like even in class. Yeah, Yes, and he also knows at least some Spanish because yesterday he opened the document in Spanish, which was a resolution from the Spanish court, and he started translating it like while like he was looking, and he did the same with the German and the French document. Like he opened the document and he highlighted a section and he was reading it in English from the document. So he knows. I think he also knows like a bunch of languages, which is quite impressive. Yes.
And she's treating them like her kids. Like inviting them over for dinner
But yeah, a lot of documents are not
voicing